Now I'm very pleased to welcome for the first time to a show a man that might even drink more beer than me, or at least better beer, Mr. Matt Landis from the Props and Hops podcast and the Bet US NFL show. You can follow Matt on Twitter at mlandis18. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show, my man. How's the hops been treating you lately?
Kiev, thanks for bringing me on. Great to connect. Yeah, I'll say maybe quality over quantity when it comes to the hops, as well as bets and other walks of life. Can't complain. LA is an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the hoppy offerings. In fact, after we wrap this up, I'm going to probably head to Highland Park Brewery before a Dodgers Braves game, and it just doesn't get much better than that. So, no complaints on my end.
Oh man, I'm so jealous. You're going to the game tonight. That is fun. The Braves champions against the Dodgers. It's almost like an NLCS thing again.
Yeah, that might be a preview of a third straight battle to head to the World Series. So I know we're talking a different sport today, but with baseball being back, the draft coming up, yeah, the beer offerings out in my neck of the woods, it just seems like all is right with the world right now.
And you know I love beer as well. We've had a few discussions before, my man, and we have to talk about it some. You know, it's something that I've loved to. Well, I mean, I guess probably since I was 15, I started drinking beer, but I didn't start drinking good beer or craft beer probably till the mid 2000s. I would say, it's kind of when Lagunitas kind of came around a little bit more, and that's when I kind of got into it a little bit. It became quality over quantity for me a little bit too. Obviously you still have some of those baseball games, but either way, I love beer. So why don't you tell us the history of your love for craft beer, Matt?
Sure. So I grew up in San Diego, and you'd think it started then. I mean, I was basically in Stone Brewing's backyard. But growing up there, I was, by definition, not of legal age to partake. So actually, fast forwarding quite a few years, my 29th birthday, my wife surprised me with a trip up the coast to San Luis Obispo. And we did a brewery tour for a couple days there. So I think we hit 7 to 10 spots over the course of a couple days. That was quality and quantity right there to kick things off. And it just really opened my eyes to a lifestyle that I kind of fell in love with. I think some of it is time and place, kind of a special occasion, going to a fun place with my wife, putting together this great surprise event. Some of my best friends were there as well, and I didn't have any idea that was in the works. So it just really set the right tone. And then once we got home from SLO, we're in the LA area, and the LA beer scene over the last decade has really started to take off. In fact, I took a class in craft beer at UCLA on nights for a few months. So I crossed the aisle. I graduated from USC back in my real college days, but for good craft beer, crossed the aisle, went to UCLA a few times, and really soaked up as much knowledge as I could to kind of earn my wings in the craft beer side of things. And it's just been a blast ever since. So yeah, coming up on 6 or 7 years of really just going head on into this space. And of course, now when I get back home to San Diego or anytime we travel, just trying to find a good local craft beer. It's crazy. Just about anywhere one would want to go, there's some really good options. And it's been really fun, not only exploring the best liquid to drink, but the best environment, in any area to really make the most of, what makes each different place pretty special in its own right.
Oh, absolutely. The beer garden is all about rating it as well. Some of these great spots, and I've been to quite a few of them in California as well. And I love San Diego. I go there once a year with the family. We get at PB, we get a house, for about a week, and just kind of soak up the sun and enjoy the beautiful sunsets it has, and obviously the awesome beer. So I'm going to ask you to give us 5 of your go-to beers right now. Now, it doesn't have to be favorite all time, but it's April, springtime. Why don't you give me 5, and I'm going to give you 5 afterwards.
Awesome. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. And I'm glad you queued this up the way you did, because when I think about this, I go back to the thought that as much as I love a good craft beer, and I try to stick to what the Brewers Association uses to define craft beer, is, small independent manufacturers, but there's a time and place for everything. I've been fortunate to have Adam Chernoff on my podcast, Props and Hops, a couple of times, and we've just talked about how the right environment can really elevate any experience. So if I think through this question, I like to start more with availability rather than the best beers in the world, the $24 4 packs. I mean, if anybody wants to nerd out on really fancy beers anytime, just hit me up and I'd be happy to talk as long as you want. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to start with something that I plan to crack open on an upcoming vacation to meet up with some in-laws from the East Coast, seeing them for the first time in a couple years in Arizona at a nice resort. We'll be sitting poolside, and at the risk of just ruining my reputation with a podcast that puts hops in the name, Natty Light is one that I'll kick it off with. And that would be because my father-in-law, his favorite beer is Natty Light. And, we could just pound a bunch of those together, and we haven't had the chance to do so, again, in more than a couple years. And in that setting, when you're poolside, you don't want anything too heavy to weigh you down. Just, something to take off the edge a bit, but stay pretty light, as the name says. So I'll say Natty Light number one. You probably didn't see that coming, and I'll go back into a more expected lane for the remaining four. Let's see, beyond Natty Light, I'll throw out Easy Jack, a really good session IPA by Firestone Walker. That's one that did open my eyes on that surprise birthday trip to San Luis Obispo all those years ago. And that was also a favorite of the late, great David Malinsky. As we record this, he passed away suddenly 4 years ago last week. And I was able to revisit some of my conversations with him on a podcast that we hosted throughout the 2017 NFL season. And he mentioned, Super Sunday being one of the few days of the year that he would drink while he was watching games that he had bet on. And Easy Jack was that, perfect companion for a game with some tickets in hand, figuring if it's going to be a 3 or 4 beer kind of setting, then Easy Jack's got an ABV similar to Natty Light, but of course the flavor blows it out of the water. So that's a nice elevated experience while still staying in a pretty manageable ABV range. If we want to ratchet that up a little bit, let's say number 3, you talked about going to Pacific Beach, spending time in San Diego on the coast down there. Swami's IPA by Pizza Port, probably one of the best IPAs when we talk not just quality, but bang for your buck. A lot of grocery stores, if anybody, I think even extending pretty widely beyond just Southern California, they'll have 6 packs of 16-ounce cans for like $2 a can. And for something that good, that's a really good deal for that style and that level of quality. You just rarely find it. And I know that I have a soft spot for, going back home and getting Swami's, just right off the tank at Pizza Port in Solana Beach. It's just a setting that you can't really match anywhere. So whether you're able to get that in person at a Pizza Port location in the San Diego area or picking it up at a grocery store, again, for the accessibility, the price point, and the overall quality, if you want a world-class West Coast IPA without breaking the bank, Swami's is probably going to be your ticket. And as we continue to work our way up here a little bit, I would say number 4, my vote will be a beer called Saison DuPont. And this is really me wanting to give a nod to the Saison style. I feel like everybody now loves to talk about IPAs and stouts and sours, and there are a lot of really good lagers out there that are easy drinking. And I love all those styles as well. But the Saison, I just feel like it's underrated. It doesn't really have any signature flavor that jumps out of the can or the bottle, but it's really easy drinking. And kind of like Easy Jack, it's a manageable ABV, and it's just really refreshing. But it has a lot more flavor than, some of the macro lagers like the Natty Light that I mentioned to kick things off. So Saison DuPont by Brasserie DuPont, a classic brewery in Belgium, but it's fairly widely available. I've seen it all across the country in my travels in recent years, especially traveling pre-pandemic. And for, again, such a world-class take on a really good style. I mean, it's from Belgium where the style originated. It's about as authentic as can be. It's pretty accessible and quite affordable. So that's my, I guess, my little love song to the Saison style. And to wrap it up, similar to Saison DuPont, maybe something for a bit of a special occasion, thinking maybe later in the evening, if we really want to ratchet things up a bit, I'll look toward a stout. And maybe this is the San Diegan in me, but Speedway Stout by AleSmith, just one of the very best. Also one that's produced at a pretty high level in terms of, how much they make and where you can get it, and the price point not being too prohibitive if you're in the mood for a stout. I just think that is such a classic take on the style. There are a lot of stouts out there now that almost taste like candy bars, and those can be good. Again, I said earlier, there's a time and place for everything. But if you just want something that's so, true to the stout style, and even if you don't love coffee like myself, I don't like anything that's too roasty, but I don't want anything that tastes like a candy bar. Speedway Stout kind of toes that line perfectly. So yeah, just rapid fire recap. Let's say the top 5 would be Natty Light of all things. Goodness, that's going to age well for me. Natty Light, Easy Jack by Firestone, Swami's IPA by Pizza Port, Saison DuPont by Brasserie DuPont in Belgium, and Speedway Stout by AleSmith.
No, thank you for your honesty. And like I said, this is a go-to beer question right now. We don't have to talk about best of all time. I mean, I'd probably have to bring in Pliny's from Russian River or
Yes,
something if I'm talking
absolutely.
about some of the best beers, but I can't get that right now. It's too hard to get for me being here in Arizona land too. But I'm going to go with April beers kind of, and it changes for me. Obviously, Thanksgiving time, I'm more into the stouts and to the porters and things like that. The winter time has its own, I guess, genre for me. But right now for the spring, being in such a hot place, I'm going to go with Summer Shandy as one of them from Line and Kugels. It is got that lemony juiciness. It's refreshing, especially after just a hard day of working outside. Or it makes me think back in the days when I used to go water skiing back in the lakes up in upper Wisconsin. Man, it's just that taste that you get out of it. It feels like summer, it tastes like summer, and it's almost summer here. So it's getting hot, and I'm
Feels like
ready
it
for
already.
it. It does, man, and that's from Lining Kugels up in Chippewa Falls, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and number 2, I'm going to go Spotted Cow. I'm going to stay with Wisconsin from New Glarus Brewing. And you can't get Spotted Cow away from Wisconsin. Well, if you buy it, it's actually illegal away from Wisconsin because they want to stay very tried and true to their niche. But it's a delicious beer, and you can get it at the airport in Milwaukee, and then you fly it down here. As a matter of fact, we just had a friend visit us, and she brought me a case of Spotted Cow, and I'm like, wow, would you like the most comfortable bed in the house? What would you like? Type thing. And I had a great time drinking that. It's more of a wheat beer, and I'm not too into wheat beers, but this one, there's some about it when it's just so cold. It's absolutely delicious and refreshing in its own way. Number 3, I am going to go with the sour beer actually, and it's a brewery that's under some tough times called Modern Times, and I'm sure you know about that a little bit. I like their sour tropical fruit goes beer, and I think it's delicious, and I think they do a great job with their goes. And I have some in my fridge right now. It just kind of feels like a little spring, like berries, sour type thing, just this time of year. Very, very thirsty for that. Gonna go with a Nipa for number 4, a hazy beer. And I'm gonna go with a White here in Arizona, Santan Brewery's Juicy Jack Haze. It's not the best Nipa in the world, but it's decent and it's good price. Kind of, you have to think about buying beer, and you think about like Dogfish Head and all that, like super expensive stuff. This is actually a good affordable Nipa beer, and it's worth every penny. And the ABV is not too bad. It's around 6.5, so it's not super high, not super low. I've seen a lot higher beers with hazy Nipas. A little bit of a mosaic hop actually in that one. And number 5, it is almost 420. You have to think about Lagunitas, and they have this beer called Waldo's, and this is the one that's absolutely going to kick you square in the ass when you drink it. It's got to be at least a triple IPA. I think it could even be quadruple, but it's very strong, maybe 11-12%. But it's that special time of year, and it's a good night beer for sure. You probably shouldn't drink more than 1 or 2 of them if you want to see straight, but it's delicious. And if you want to get crazy into hops, you might not want to drink that for your first beer. You might want to almost ease into that. But I don't know if you had Wallows, Matt, but I'm in some beer groups, and it's one of their go-tos.
I'll have to put that on my radar. I'm not familiar with it yet, but as you were describing it, I couldn't resist looking it up on Untapped and seeing 11.7% ABV. So that, I guess they call it a triple. I think loosely defined, if it were, 12% or greater, they'd probably call that a quadruple IPA. So that's really getting up there. But yeah, maybe kind of, it's almost like a stout in the sense that might be one that you end your night with, to your point of not starting there. But yeah, for starters, one that you mentioned earlier, Spotted Cow. I've just got to say that I had the honor of trying it for the first time at Bet Bash a couple of weeks ago during the national title game at Circa Sportsbook. My good friend Mike Roselli hosts a podcast called the Doggy Juice Pod, and he's from the Chicago area, so he brought some spotted cow to Vegas with him. Kind of at my request. I don't think I tried too hard to convince him, but he probably read between the lines and totally delivered. And that was a fantastic experience. I think they call that also like a bit of a farmhouse beer. So that's probably also a very approachable take on something like Saison DuPont that I mentioned as well. So I think we're seeing eye to eye when it comes to, the hops, or, you mentioned a good sour beer as well. So happy to take any and all of what you just mentioned as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's no Natty Light, because I remember Natural Ice. It was Natty Ice we used to get in college, half barrels, because they were like, what, $20 a half barrel, the cheapest shit you can possibly get for a keg stand. And that's where I got the Natty from when you mentioned that. So you completely blew me out of left field here with that one. But I understand it, because if you're like playing golf all day, or if you're at a baseball game, you don't go for the heavier IPAs. You go for something light, and it makes sense, and it's got some nostalgia to it for you. So that completely makes sense and hits home for me. So thank you for sharing that with me. I wrote them all down too. I am going to try that Swami's from the Pizza Port when I get to next time I get to PB. So we'll be
Awesome.
checking that.
And just to make sure you've got it down right, it's Natty Light, NATTYLIGHT. Really hard to find, but I think maybe help you if you get in a tough spot struggling to track down any Natty Light anytime in your future.
I'm sure you can help us all out for that one, my man. Well, let's get into a little bit of your history in the sports betting. And when did you start liking the aspect of sports betting or sports investing, whatever you like to call it? Or at least, why don't you go right into the media aspect of it as well?
Sure. So I, as long as I can remember, have been a big sports fan. Grew up in Southern California, had plenty of local teams. But it was early on in my career, a few years after college, I distinctly recall a friend and coworker coming into the office one Monday morning with the biggest grin on his face. And, it's Monday morning, and the job was fine, but people usually weren't thrilled at that time of the week. So I asked him what was up, and he said he hit a big parlay in college football that past Saturday. And to me, it felt like he might have thought he was the smartest guy in the world at that point. And, maybe a bit ego, as much as humility is really a key in this thing long term, but a bit of ego to get me going. Just figured, as a sports fan at the time, hey, I think I know at least as much as this guy. Let me give this a shot. And I opened up my first account for $50 at an offshore that he hooked me up with, and made a $10 bet, which felt like a big bet at the time. But I think one of my bigger strengths was the ability to remain objective. And that first $10 bet was against my alma mater, USC. They hosted Arizona. I believe this would have been 2011. And USC won the game. Arizona covered the spread. And I was just on cloud nine for winning, such a small bet. But I felt like I was off and running at that point. And I think back to that stage of my life, and also, driving to the office. I remember every Friday hearing Colin Cowherd do his Blazing Five, and he would bring on RJ Bill from pregame.com. A lot of people have probably, had that experience listening to that back in the day. And really the best thing that came of that for me was that after listening to enough of those segments, I think there was one time where I was new to betting and Colin got really hot. So just kind of survivorship bias on my part to stay in the game and build up some bankroll. But really, after hearing pregame.com enough, I'm like, okay, what's this thing? Let me go check it out. And one thing really stood out to me when I did that. There was this column called Point Blank by David Malinsky. I've already mentioned him, just one of the best people I've ever known. And I was blown away by how intelligently he could break down a game, but how fun he could make it, weaving in really good food and music and just, lifestyle components that seemingly had nothing to do with sports, but really tying the whole picture together, in addition to being a really sharp mind. And at Point Blank, I think I really started to realize, as I read that and started to get involved in the forum, the difference between knowing sports and betting on sports. A lot of people know sports really well and will never beat it in betting. And a lot of people who are really good at betting might not know the first thing about certain teams. I've heard the story that Spanky was told Andrew Luck retired and he didn't know who that was, when it just, really broke the whole news cycle right before that football season a few years back. So really starting to hone in on that delineation between knowing sports and betting on sports, and getting to know Dave over the years really fueled my journey along those lines. And it led to some media opportunities to get things rolling. For reasons I might never fully understand, in the summer of 2017, David Malinsky reached out to me about doing a podcast together. I said yes right away. I was part thrilled because he was somebody I had respected for years, and part terrified because I had no idea how to make a podcast and it was too good of an opportunity to mess up. So I really had to elevate my game. But we did it together for the 2017 NFL season, a podcast called House of Yards. And from there, after Dave's sudden, untimely passing, I was able to keep in touch with a lot of his followers from the Point Blank community, which at that time had gone to sportsbookreview.com. So with that SBR community, stayed plugged in for a few years. And then it's kind of a passion project during the early days of the pandemic, or I guess, a few months in before the 2020 NFL season, I started Props and Hops, kind of thinking, okay, House of Yards was the original betting and beer podcast that I knew and got to be involved in. Props and Hops was kind of carrying that along in my own way. And that's been a joy to do for a couple seasons now. And that helped open doors with the Bet US NFL show that I was so fortunate to do, primarily for getting to know guys like Las Vegas Chris and Scott Kellen. They've just been a dream to work with and to get to know, and even opening doors to go on VSiN a couple of times and, meet the crew there. And I got to meet them in person at Bet Bash a couple weeks ago as well. So it kind of all started. My journey in betting led me to discover Point Blank, which led to getting to know Dave, which led to the media opportunity. So none of it has been really planned very much, but it's just kind of led me down, a really fun path. And I try to keep an open mind and, and work hard and build good relationships and just really say yes to any opportunity that might come my way. And so far, that's been extremely rewarding.
Well, Dave certainly saw something in you, and you continue to prove it with such great content and great delivery on your podcast. I just listened to it last week, and you had a great tribute to him, and it was a very enjoyable listening to you guys talk a few years back about some of the old lines that we had on USC and a couple of things about the Chargers, your favorite team. So really, really cool to see that. So getting into the Props and Hops, you kind of answered that question. You kind of started that after Dave's passing. Was that in 2017 as well? And or what year did you get going with that? And what's it about? Is it just about props, or tell the audience? Is it about kind of everything?
Sure, it's about everything. I mean, Props and Hops, I probably wrote down 100 names and toyed with different ideas. It just seemed like it had a good ring to it, nice and succinct. But it's, all things betting and beer. I'm trying to pursue the best in betting and beer, but certainly betting much more than props. And the beer can be the nicest craft beer to something like a Natty Light. So the full spectrum is welcome. And yeah, I started it in 2020 during the pandemic. For the first few years after Dave's passing, I kept in touch doing some writing on SBR to, keep in touch with his community. But the podcast idea followed a few years later. Part of it, I don't know, I could probably talk to a therapist about it. Maybe I didn't want to do a podcast right away because it would hit too close to home after having worked with Dave, and then trying to, even something like taking out the same microphone that I recorded with Dave. I'm speaking into it right now. Just like that didn't come out of the closet for a little while, but still got to keep in touch with some people through writing, then got the itch to get back into podcasting. So it's been a couple NFL seasons now. And I think the concept really for, being a one-man band more or less behind Props and Hops, whereas I was working with Dave on our previous podcast, House of Yards. When it comes to Props and Hops, I know that I'm not necessarily the best bettor or the best content creator, but I like to think I have something to offer in both of those areas. And I think what I do best is identifying the signal from the noise. And most of what we hear out there is probably noise. So you can probably dismiss 95% plus of what you hear, but really looking to dig into that small portion of things that really resonated. And from there, highlight the best of the best. So I think with Props and Hops, looking to, kind of bring curation to the table as my form of creation is how I like to look at it.
Oh, absolutely, man. And I love it. It's great. It's a great concept. And two of some of my favorite things, sports betting and beer. So congratulations on that. And I know it's going really well. And obviously Chris chiming in. Thank you, Chris. Complimenting you on how nice you are. And he's also a big fan of yours yourself. So let's move on.
It's mutual.
Absolutely. Let's move on to some NFL stuff then, my man, because the NFL never dies, does it, Matt? And it's, I guess, all the tweets and all the you see that from guys like Adam Schefter, and it's just I still have it on notification. I used to shut it off, but I still have it on notification because too much sports betting content coming out. Right, these lines are moving for the draft. There's more and more props coming out for the NFL draft, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. And I guess for starters, what are your thoughts on this draft class in general?
Yeah, when I think about this class, and maybe it's because I'll be going to a baseball game tonight, so I'm mixing my sports a bit, but I think of a parallel to, a Major League Baseball pitcher who gets stronger as the game goes on. This draft feels a lot deeper than it is top heavy. So that's just the big takeaway. It's probably a less than ideal year for the Jags to be picking 1 overall, the Panthers to be, at 6 with nothing after that pick for a long time, or the Jets and Giants both having multiple picks early on. Maybe not the worst year as a Chargers fan for my team to be picking, almost smack in the middle of the first round at 17. Beyond an overall thought on the class, I just think one position group that's been talked about a lot. I've got a funny feeling about this quarterback class. It's a really hard position to evaluate, and I know that nobody jumps out this year, but I think 1 or 2 of these guys are going to be a lot better than we think. Don't ask me who, but I just feel like it's so easy to write this off as a class that is going to be very forgettable. What was the class years ago with what was it, Ponder and Gabbert and Locker, and it was just bust after bust.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that would almost be too simplistic. Usually we're surprised. I mean, thinking back just to a couple years ago, I was watching the draft when the Dolphins picked Tua right before the Chargers picked Justin Herbert, and I was a little bummed at the time. And I had friends texting me apologizing for the fact that the Chargers got saddled with Herbert. And I remember thinking, like, yeah, I know Tua had the better, projections at the time, but we don't know. And this stuff can humble you in a hurry, because fast forward a couple years and let's see how that aged. So this class, if nothing else, it reminds me that in betting, whether it's the drafter or any bet type in any sport, requires a healthy degree of what I think of as humble confidence. I mean, if you're going to lay the vig and go head to head with sports books and the rest of the marketplace, you've got to have a degree of confidence. But at the same time, if you get too confident, you'll be humbled in a hurry. So trying just to keep that balance of humility with the right dose of confidence to really try to thread that needle in the long run.
Manage your highs and manage your lows, my man. That's how it is, because it's tough. It's a tough thing. And the best of the best, 56, 58% is what I always say. If they're and that is the top of the line as well. So absolutely. You gotta be prepared for the next day, great bankroll management, and keep the same philosophies for the draft itself. There are some weak lines in this draft, I think, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen, because we don't know what these GMs are going to do. I could say what this team needs and what this team needs, but that doesn't mean that they think that. And that's how I've gotten burned in the past here. But it's definitely fun to look at, and having multiple small plays, I think, is where it's at. And I also agree with you. We don't know what this quarterback class really is going to be. Maybe these kids take a massive step forward. Maybe they're way better than you think, because all you can see is them play against their competition. It's a lot about situation. If the quarterback gets into a team that is ready to win with a new coach that's much better than the last one, well, then he's in a good situation. So I'm really excited to see what happens in the future. But let's get into the position totals a little bit. Have you got a chance to kind of look at the totals on the quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers? For example, I can pull up DraftKings here just so we can kind of be consistent. And I'll just give you a few numbers. And there's going to be some juice on these numbers, of course. Quarterbacks will start over 2.5 is like minus 250. Do you think like 3 is the correct number? Because it's trying to tell you over 2.5, but probably under 3.5, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction is if they were to have this first round draft 10 times in, some alternate universe, then we probably see exactly 3 quarterbacks go about 7 times. So I know some books are at 3.5, would think under, some books 2.5, you look to the over. Again, the price is the, big determining factor in all this. And I think with most position groups, the lines are probably about right at this point. But one thing you touched on that I think would be a recurring theme for my draft approach would be, the notion of value versus vig. A lot of people think, oh, if a bet has value, that means it has a big plus number attached to it. And I think with the draft, there are times, especially with some more recreational books that know that, rec bettors aren't going to lay a big price. They almost, can't set the vig high enough for certain types of bets. So for those with the intestinal fortitude, I think oftentimes the best value we'll find all year in the NFL is some pretty heavily juiced bets in the draft. And minus 250 isn't even getting that heavy, relative to some other stuff I think about. But I would have to lean over 2.5 quarterbacks at that price point. I haven't bet that yet. I probably, gun to my head, I definitely would look to the over. I think we can bank on Pickett and Willis going in the first round. Sounds like Ritter's probably, a good chance to go there as well. And then there's, Matt Corral and Sam Howell have been getting some noise recently. And again, we can talk about this class and how do any of these guys project to be all that good? Why would teams waste valuable draft picks on them? Well, this is so much less about what we think teams should do and trying to develop a better understanding of what they will do. And ultimately, for a lot of GMs who could be on the hot seat, same with head coaches, a good quarterback on a team-friendly deal really holds the keys to the kingdom. I mean, look at the Chiefs under Mahomes, what the Bills are doing with Allen, what the Chargers might one day do with Justin Herbert if they can get their act together in these next couple of years. I think Ron on your show, I believe it was last week, brought up a good point about probability and just trying to think about this probabilistically with that quarterback number. If we're looking at minus 250, that equates to a 71.4% break-even percentage. I would say it's probably more in the 75 to 80% likelihood range that we see at least 3 quarterbacks go. So, I probably make the fair price closer to 300. I know this is juicy, but could only look to the over 2.5 at minus 250.
I agree with you. And it's if you want to lay it, these GMs are going to fall in love with the quarterback. And then you got Detroit. They're going to be kind of at pick 32, right? Maybe there's two quarterbacks gone, and they're going to think to themselves, well, what if we wait to 34 and somebody grabs the Jaguars at 33, and then they're going to panic and possibly pick that third quarterback or fourth, even, of course, at pick 32. So I agree with you. It's a big fat price. I'm not quite sure if I'm ready to lay it, but I think next week, right before the draft, we're going to have a little bit more information on some of that. The real intriguing thing is the tight ends being under at minus 700, under 0.5, meaning 0 tight ends for the first round at minus 700. And the over is about plus 500, plus 475, as we see here on DraftKings. The only thing I can say is they're trying to sucker people in right now to bet this tight end thing. And I don't see a big difference between, I guess, what's rated in a lot of draft boards as the first tight end and the third tight end. So I think people are going to wait.
Yeah, and I don't think I've seen a tight end mocked in the first round anywhere, certainly not among the guys I follow most closely. And again, the final mocks will be the most informative. So to your point, we'll have more information next week. But right now, if I think about that price, again, thinking as a recurring theme, VIG versus value, laying 7-1 might seem like it's impossible to have value just at that price point. But I would bet that 7-1 on no tight end in the first round has more value than something like, a plus 2,000, getting a 20-1 payout on Sam Howell to go in the top 10. I've seen that this week, and, it should probably be closer to 200-1. So just because you're laying a big price doesn't mean you're not possibly getting value. That said, at this point, kind of like quarterbacks, I'd say even a softer lean than the quarterback position for me. If anything, I would bet the no. But if I'm tying up that kind of VIG 7-1, I'd rather lay it much closer to the draft and make it maybe a short-term loan with a nice interest rate coming my way in return. It could lose, but just thinking again, probabilistically here, break-even percentage on minus 700 is 87.5%. If I decide to make that bet, going to be a lot closer to the draft and maybe look at it as a one-day loan with a 12.5% return on the interest.
That's a great way to look at it. And fantastic point there, because you're right. They look big, but they might not even be close to big enough. And a lot of my friends that bet the politics, bet elections do this all the time, and they make a killing. New York Democrat, you can't make that number big enough. And that's how they win money, by doing that. And they do the same thing with other states. It just makes total sense to me. And look at it from a probability standpoint and then figure out your number, is what I always try to tell everybody. Matt, did you make any plays on, I guess the position totals is a question, or that you'd feel okay for giving out on this show?
Sure. So there's one that I have played. Again, the numbers moved, so I don't want to make it all about trying to show off a number that nobody can get now. I do still consider it bettable, and that's if we look at safeties over 1.5. First, I know I said I lean toward quarterbacks over 2.5. Tight ends probably won't go, but that's a pretty inconsequential number. As I catch myself saying, over for another position group here, in addition to quarterbacks, there's only so many spots to go in the first round. So a lot of bettors just look toward overs for everything. It's kind of the equivalent of betting favorites and overs in totals with regular season games. So I want to be mindful of the fact that there are 32 spots to go in the first round. So if you go over on every position, you're going to run out of slots at a certain point. But I think there's room for 2, if not 3 safeties in this first round. A big thing to make sure you're reading the fine print on if you invest in this is the classification of a guy like Dax Hill out of Michigan. I checked the NFL.com draft profile has him pegged as a safety. So most books should follow suit, but a lot of people are projecting him, playing a cornerback role in the league. So just knowing how that's going to be graded, I think that's key for any bets, but especially something like this. Because in all likelihood, I think we're going to see Kyle Hamilton and Dax Hill go in the first round, and maybe Lewis Cine. But if I look at this again from a probabilistic standpoint, a bit of math coming up here, but I hope this helps, drive the framework for what I've used to succeed over the years. And I think a lot of winning bettors think along these lines as well. In the framework of this bet, I've seen Hill as minus 150 to go in the first round, and that equates to a break-even percentage of 60% that he does go. But that was a one-way line. And when you can't bet the no, the book's probably hiding a lot of vig. So the true probability, probably closer to 55% that Dax Hill gets picked in the first round. A guy like Lewis Cine, I've seen him, same book, even money to go. That equates to 50%, but again, a one-way line. So accounting for the vig, probably more like 45% chance that he goes in the first round. So if we keep that in mind and we just assume that Hamilton's going, again, Hamilton probably not going to go in the top 10 anymore, but I don't think anybody's expecting him to, possibly fall out of the first round. For this prop to lose, assuming we get Hamilton, then that has to mean that Dax Hill and Lewis Cine both don't go in the first round. Based on the earlier percentages I talked about, just multiplying 45% that Hill doesn't go times 55% that Cine doesn't go. That just gives us a 1 in 4 probability, 25%, that both of those guys don't get selected in the first round. Just using some basic math, 1 minus 25% means 75% that at least one of them goes when we talk Hill and Cine. Along with Hamilton, that gets us over 1.5. 75% odds equates to a line of minus 300, like you just said. I'm seeing consensus right now of about minus 260. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. Certainly like the number when it was lower, but I still think this has room to go up. I only think it will go up, especially if more places confirm that Dax Hill is classified as a safety. So I would say I'd make it good up to minus 275. Again, that's a big price to lay at face value, but considering that value versus vig dynamic, I think it's one of the better options on the board right now.
I think it's fantastic. And I absolutely love how you broke down the numbers for our listeners. That's what I love to do. I love to preach going by the numbers, making educated decisions. Fantastic, Matt. And just to piggyback on that, I'm going to go with Dax Hill under 29.5. I think he is selected under that. Almost every mock draft I've seen has at least 2 safeties, some 3 going in the first round. And I think Dax Hill goes under that because he can also play cornerback. I think a lot of teams want that flexibility, especially with a great athlete like Daxton Hill. And so I laid minus 125 on this, and I think it's just going to go up, Matt.
Yeah, and that's a good proxy for safeties over 1.5 because you're not laying as much vig. I mean, yes, there's a chance that Hill goes at 30, 31, or 32, but for the trade-off with how much less vig you're laying at that number, you can pretty much bank on Hamilton going. There's multiple ways it's going to cap, so I like that game plan as well.
All right, well, wonderful. I have time to give out one more play, and I'm going to see what you think on it. I'm going to give out the Buffalo Bills first pick position group is a defensive back. The only other one that bugs me a little bit is could they go with a running back? I just don't think that there is a breakout running back. And I think about what Buffalo had last year. They drafted a bunch of defensive ends tight. They got their quarterback. They've got some fantastic receivers. They got their tight ends. We don't see a tight end coming in the first group. I just do not see how they do not go defensive back when that was their number one need. And I'm getting a plus 175 here, Matt. I think this is a fantastic play, and I think this is only going to go down as well.
Yeah, well, again, depending on a guy like Dax Hill getting classified as a safety or a defensive back, that might be your ticket for Buffalo, or there's any number of guys they could go with as well. I think the logic checks out. When I look at non binary outcomes on the betting board, I always have some pause because I know that for each additional option, other than a yes, no, or an over under, every option beyond just those standard two usually bakes in a lot more vig for the book. And I got burned a couple years ago. I think the first time I did this in the draft, I bet the first running back would be DeAndre Swift, and that was the 2020 draft when the Chiefs snagged CEH at the end of the first round. And I just felt
Yep.
like such a fool, even though in sample size of one, it doesn't mean that that was a bad bet in this case, but it reinforced that notion to me of bets with non-binary outcomes usually come with more vig. But at the same time, so much of this can be about getting good information, and the logic you laid out makes a lot of sense. Also, shopping for the best number. There's no Don Best screen for this stuff, so a lot of books might have rogue lines where you can really extract a lot of value. So I haven't even given that one enough consideration yet to have a very strong opinion. Fundamentally, I'm always wary of non-binary bets, but when there's good information and a good line to be found, then I think it can behoove any bettor to keep a very open mind.
Yes, thank you. And I do get nervous for non-binary bets as well. It's a great point, but I also saw how they got Von Miller as an edge rusher, obviously for 6 years and $120 million, and they signed two defensive tackles, I believe, Daquan Jones, Tim Settle, to replace Harrison Phillips at left. So it almost covers those bases for me. It makes me just really feel that this could be a good plus money winner here. So I'm feeling good about that. We'll see if what happens, Matt. Do you have any other plays you'd like to share with our listeners?
One that I found today that is available at the moment would be for a shopper looking at Chris Olave under 17.5, but it comes down to shopping for the best number. At one of the sharper offshores, I saw that at minus 150, and the break even probability for that bet, the Novig line was minus 130. So the break even probability, I believe, was 56.5%. I saw another offshore, same exact bet, Olave under 17.5, minus 110. That's a 52.4% break even probability. That might not sound like a big edge, just a few percentage points in the low to mid 50s, but that's a bigger edge than we're probably going to find on just about any point spread all season long, unless somebody has news of a quarterback or key player being out. There's a big line movement due to injury news. But over the course of most weeks, edges like that just don't exist looking at a market as efficient as full game spreads and totals. So just doing some shopping, if you can find that Olave, minus 110, or I'd say even minus 120 would be a good ceiling for that bet, then something like that works out. I know a lot of people don't have access to that. So what I would suggest is just over this next week and change, shopping for the best number where you can, and really trying to be diligent about reading and listening for the right information, especially medical red flags. I know that last year there was a guy like Aziz Ojulari. Some whispers came out about his medicals, and his over under was steamed upward. So the market was fading him, settled around 21.5. He fell out of the first round altogether. So this year, there are guys like Andrew Booth Jr., a cornerback from Clemson, who had multiple injuries, missed most of the pre-draft workout process, coming off of sports hernia surgery. That's pretty well known at this stage, but his slot right now is 26.5 with a pretty evenly split vig on the over under 26.5. Also, a guy like Nakobe Dean, a linebacker out of Georgia, starting to hear some whispers about his medicals. Right now, he's at 28.5. So I would think, if anything, maybe looking over his way. So beyond any individual picks right now, just that kind of thought process, things to look out for, shopping for the best lines, looking out especially for any medical red flags lately. If you hear something early, probably going to be a good bet to take that player to go over his projected draft slot. Things like that, I think, are really going to inform this final week and a half of the lead up to the draft.
Yeah, that's such a great point here. And Olave, I just don't see him getting past Philadelphia here at 15. I mean, there's Philly, there's Houston that needs to find out what Mills is worth, right? There's just a lot of teams after the Wilson and possibly the London pick that you're thinking that maybe the Jets might make Drake London. If it's Olave there, so be it, right? Anything under 17 and a half, absolutely love it, my man. Well, we're out of time. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Matt. You shared some great information and some great ways that we should be looking at this draft. Where could our listeners and viewers get your great information and follow your shows?
Yeah, thanks for having me on once again. I think the best one-stop shop would be on Twitter at mlandis18. That's MLANDES 18. And then Props and Hops, the podcast that I drop weekly wherever you get your podcasts. And I look forward to having you on shortly as well.
Oh, absolutely. Can't wait for that. So make sure you guys follow Matt at mlandis18 on Twitter.